Great, thanks for the invitation to speak here and to hear these great papers. My talk is going to be a little bit broader in terms of the scope of remembering 1916 than we've just heard. That I'm going to look at how the Easter Rising was remembered across Ireland. And my scope's also going to be a little bit broader in time because I want to actually look at how the memory of the Easter Rising has changed over the past century. And I want to focus very much on the political aspects of memory. So it might be useful to begin by thinking a little bit about some of the terms that we used when we think about the past. I think the title of this evening's event is Remembering Important? And I would say that both history and commemoration are important, but in different ways, because they're different things, and yet we tend to use the same kind of term, remembering, to cover both of them. So history, and by that I suppose I mean an attempt to write a scholarly, a rigorous kind of history. History is an effort to understand the past in its own terms. What happened in the past? It's not an effort to, it's intended to look at the past in a sort of objective, dispassionate way, rather than as a kind of an argument about the present. It's concerned with things like researching sources from the archives, testing evidence, analysing different interpretations of the past, striving to grasp with the biases that we all have, weighing up competing explanations, and also continually going back to the story, trying to write it and rewrite it to get at a kind of the best possible understanding we can have of the past. And that's how I would see history. Commemoration is centred much more on the present than the past. It's concerned, and we've been seeing some really interesting examples of that this evening. Commemoration is concerned with the values and the lessons that we in contemporary society can take from the events of the past. It's much more bound up with meaning and identity and emotions, and ideas such as sacrifice and honour and integrity than it is in understanding the past in its own terms. So I suppose what I'm saying is commemoration, like history, relates to the past, but it has different functions. It's about how we negotiate identities, political values, and also, as we've seen quite movingly, I think, in different ways in several of the papers, how we come to terms with traumatic events from the past, and that trauma can go down generation after generation. But the distinction between history and commemoration gets a bit fuzzier if we think about terms like popular history, how the past is understood by most people, the shorthand history that we all carry around with us in our heads of important events. And also terms like collective memory, how communities remember their own history. And in Northern Ireland, of course, as in most places, we have competing versions of popular history and collective memory. To walk around the Shankill, for example, is to absorb a history lesson simply by looking at the pictures on the walls and the murals about King William and the liberties bequeathed by the Glorious Revolution, to learn about the Ulster Covenant and the defence of the Unionist community from the nationalist threat, to learn about the sacrifices of Protestants on the Somme, and also, as you can see in the more contemporary images, loyalists as defenders of their community in the late 20th century. And of course, if you're going to take a walk down the Falls and look at the murals there, you absorb a very different popular history lesson. You learn about Britain's persecution of the Irish nation, the famine as genocide, the heroism of the Easter Rising, and as in the Shankill, Republicans in the more recent struggle as defenders of their community. And I think it's really interesting how saturated we are with history, particularly in areas like the Falls and the Shankill. And I think one reason for that is because contemporary politics take a lot of meaning. They get a lot of weight from rooting themselves in longer historical narratives. It's a very good way of making a political argument to put a struggle in a wider context of a century or indeed many centuries of struggle. And what I would say about this kind of history, I mean, you can see in both these murals, the UVF are rooting their story in the UVF of 1914, something which many people would object to and others less so. And in the Republican mural, you can see how they're rooting contemporary struggles in 1916 or 1867 or 1798 and the kind of context that Tom has brought out. And I would say that these kind of popular histories, which reflect a kind of collective memory that exists within communities, aren't necessarily false, but they distort true selectivity. And by presenting very simple or simplistic narratives about a complex past that leaves out all the grey areas, the nuance, the complexity, all the awkward bits that is real history when we look at it up close. Now, in the past, professional historians, people like me, several decades ago, I suppose, would have been often preoccupied with criticizing popular history and critiquing collective memory, which they often described as myth. And so the aim of professional historians a few decades ago, I think, was to replace myth, these kind of ideas of history that you see here, with an objective or a true history of the past. And I think the idea was that if people could be given a sort of a balanced, measured, nuanced understanding of the complexity of the past, they would become better citizens. Rather than underpinning bigotry or narrow positions or violent, polarized positions, history could promote a more tolerant, inclusive, flexible sense of identity that could bring about changes in communities. And I think maybe some people still believe there's something to that, but it seems to me that there's been an interesting shift in recent years in terms of how people think about this. Historians are now pretty reluctant to use terms like truth or objectivity. There's a greater awareness that we also construct narratives about the past, maybe based more on evidence than others, but we're also writing versions of the past. And also, rather than just trying to debunk popular myths about the past, many historians are now very interested in thinking about the meaning and value of popular history and collective memories. Why do certain versions of the past, such as these, resonate with communities? And why do these popular understandings of the past change over time? So 20 or 30 years ago, you would have seen a lot of murals of King William. Now it's mostly murals of the Somme. So this raises quite interesting questions that we can think about. But to turn to 1916, what's remembered when the Easter Rising is commemorated? I would say at least two different things. The historical event that took place in 1916, but also the meaning of the Rising, the meaning that emerged afterwards as a kind of a symbol of the struggle for independence, or alternatively, as a symbol of the Irish state that was achieved subsequently. And the first of these, the Rising as a historical event, I think is relatively straightforward. We know what happened in Easter week 1916, although we can differ over interpretations and justifications. But the second of these, the meaning of the Rising, what does the Rising mean, is a much trickier question, because the Rising not only means different things at different periods of time, but it means different things in different places at the same time. In the south, where I'm obviously from, 1916 really functions now as a kind of Independence Day, as you saw this Easter. In the north, for many Republicans, commemoration of 1916 is bound up more with some of the unresolved problems of the revolutionary period, with partition, the unfinished revolution, than it is bound up with the achievements of independence in the south. And for both Northern Republicans and Unionists, the legacy of 1916 is also bound up with the Troubles in a way in which it no longer is in the South, and that's one of the reasons you see a more popular attitude taken towards commemoration of the Rising in recent years in Dublin. So this process, so for most of the past century, commemorating 1916 was difficult and contested in the South. And there was two main reasons for this. Firstly, the legacy of 1916 was always used by the Irish state to project certain values or ideas. And as a result, the legacy of the Rising was always fought over by different Republican groups who didn't wish the state to lay claim to the ownership of the legacy of the Easter Rising. And secondly, the commemoration of the Rising also reflected the context in which it occurred. And for that reason, it's always changing, because the context is always changing. And this process begins almost immediately after the Rising. So although the Rising, as Tom mentioned, involved very radical ideas and radical groups, socialists and feminists and so on, the state that emerged from that Rising was shaped much more by conservative, nationalist and Catholic influences, as Marcia has brought out. So the most striking way in which the legacy of the Rising was made less radical in the 20s and 30s was by being framed through a Catholic perspective. And you can see that here in some of the imagery. And for example, that has implications for how women are projected too, not as the equal citizens of the proclamation, but as passive. And various Catholic aspects of the Rising were emphasized. Patrick Pearse's writings, in which he compared himself to Christ, the conversion of Protestant leaders like Casement and Markovich to Catholicism. The executed leaders were first publicly commemorated at the month's mind masses after the Rising and through Catholic writings. And the Catholic Church itself played a role, for self-interested reasons, in what has been described as baptizing the Fenians. So, I mean, the Catholic Church condemned Fenian violence before 1916, and the Catholic Church was no friend of Connolly's socialism, but by certainly by 1917, 1918, the Catholic Church is very much getting on board with the more positive identification with the Rising and its achievements. And one consequence of this, as we've heard already, is that the role of women is gradually airbrushed out of the history of the Easter Rising. And here you can see how literally one woman, Elizabeth O'Farrell, whose feet you can see in the first picture on the left, by the time you get to the far right, Elizabeth O'Farrell has been airbrushed out of history. Not in fairness by the state, but by a newspaper editor who wanted a less messy picture. But it's a nice symbol for what does happen to the story of women's involvement. And by 1966, when the 50th anniversary comes, as you can see from these stamps, women are sort of really not part of the story anymore. And going back to 1941, you can see here how the Easter Rising has been commemorated in a very Catholic and Gaelic context. A map of Ireland in the first stamp, a Celtic cross in the second stamp. And if you look at the stamp on the right, what you can see is that the political context in 1941 for the 25th anniversary is about defending the state during the emergency from attack from all enemies, German or British. And you can also see, interestingly, that the proclamation text has been translated from English into Irish as a kind of a Gaelic agenda, conservative Gaelic agenda has been promoted. And commemoration of 1916 has really nearly always involved contestation. 1966, for example, sees tensions between different narratives of 1916, even from within the same government, the same Southern government. So President De Valera, for example, makes a speech where he speaks of the need to achieve a united Ireland. And many did see what happened in 1966, and you can see the parade, the military parade there, as a kind of triumphalist, traditionalist, old-school kind of resurgent nationalism. But if you look at what Sean Lemass is saying at the exact same time, the Taoiseach Sean Lemass is saying is quite different to what President De Valera is saying. Lemass is trying to construct a less militaristic kind of civic patriotism. You can struggle for Ireland not by dying for Ireland, but by making it a successful economy. So these different kind of messages are playing out in 66. And if we go north of the border, we can see in 66 all sorts of tensions. Loyalists led by Ian Paisley used the commemoration very effectively to undermine Terence O'Neill's moderate reformist project, basically by putting it up to O'Neill to ban Republicans from commemorating 1966. And Republicans, including a young Gerry Adams, one of the figures who leads the march, or he's a member of the march in 1966, are also using the idea of 1916 to mobilize a different kind of political project. As we move closer, we can see that the outbreak of the Troubles sees efforts by the Provisional IRA to lay claim to the legacy of the Easter Rising. And I might if you have a look at that mural there, it's quite interesting, the picture, because it's actually the same picture that you see here in the stamp, which I think is a wonderful visual example of how the provisional movement was essentially saying, well, no, the legacy of 1916 is ours. It doesn't belong to the state. And not surprisingly, this causes concern, embarrassment, discomfort for the southern state, which of course is largely opposed to what's going on north of the border. And so this new contestation of the Rising in the context of the Troubles spurs a reevaluation of the Rising. It leads to a kind of a caution, even an embarrassment in official government circles. If you blinked, you would have missed the 1991 commemoration. It was so quick outside the GPO. It also spurs a reevaluation amongst historians and in newspapers and amongst commentators about really important questions, such as whether the rebels had a democratic mandate, whether the consequences of their actions were positive, and so on. And probably the high point of this discomfort around the 1916 is in 1991. And it's not really until 2006 that things begin to decisively change back to a more upbeat public commemoration of 1916 in the South. And perhaps the best example of that is the military parade. In the early 1970s, the military parade down Sackville Street, which you see here, disappeared in the context of the Troubles. It comes back in 2006. And again, of course, the context is crucial. The Good Friday Agreement, the peace process, it's become safer to celebrate, commemorate the Rising. Recent years have also seen a wider reevaluation of the Rising. So we have a lot of new sources, such as the Bureau of Military History, which gives a greater understanding of the complexity of the period. We have new interpretations. The idea, for example, of a lost revolution. There's a greater awareness that some groups of people lost out from the Irish Revolution, Southern Protestants, Northern Catholics, for example. There's a greater understanding of a gap between the radical ideals of the proclamation and the socially conservative ethos that emerged in the southern state. And people like Helena Maloney, as we heard in the first presentation, are now very decisively being written back into the history of the period, and she was one of the figures that I looked at in my book. Working class Dublin figures who are kind of written out of the story, many of them women. And what's really interesting about 2016 is how visible women have become as part of the story. They're literally on the buses when you're walking around the city. They're on the posters and the Dart and so on, which is really interesting. That's part of a new willingness in the South to look at new perspectives, to look at overlooked victims. This is Sean Foster, who was a 2-year-old, one of the youngest civilian victims of the Easter Rising. And now people like that are very much part of groups once forgotten that are being remembered and part of the public consciousness. So in many respects, the picture of 1916 in 2016 is unrecognizable from the picture of 1916 in 1966. The gap between collective history and scholarly history has got a lot smaller very quickly. Simplistic depictions of the 1916 leaders as heroic martyrs have given way to more nuanced awareness of the complexities of 1916 and its consequences, both positive and negative. So the commemoration of 1916 forms part of a wider complicating of the narrative of Irish history, with overlooked groups such as First World War servicemen restored to the narrative of Irish history. And there's been a shift also from debates about 1916 being essentially concerned with the relationship between England and Ireland and concerns about violence, to much more interesting questions about, well, what did these people want to achieve? How did they want to transform Ireland? So I think, echoing one of our earlier speakers, rather than simply reenacting the past, the most successful forms of commemoration allow its energies, the energies of the past, to imagine the possibility of alternative futures. The Rising, once a source of political division in Ireland, has become part of the process of reconciliation. And two striking examples I want to leave on here: the Queen's presence at a memorial for the Republican dead, and the Irish state's support for a memorial at Glasnevin, which commemorates all the dead of the revolution together, Irish Republicans, Crown forces, and civilians, albeit not without controversy. But these are really radical shifts in the commemorative landscape. And I think there's a good news story here, kind of echoing Philip's point, about the possibilities of rethinking how we see the past, particularly difficult, contested past, through commemoration. And I think it's something which might prove useful in Northern Ireland as we face into a series of very difficult commemorations ranging from the centenary of partition to the 50th anniversary of the Troubles.